A doctor died in 1904, and his final words were about champagne. Not a prescription, not a diagnosis, just champagne. This was Anton Chekhov, the man who changed how we tell stories, and the irony of his death was something he would have written himself. Transported back to Moscow in a refrigerated railway car meant for oysters. Mourners accidentally following the wrong funeral procession. The whole thing reads like one of his own dark comedies, except this time there was no curtain call. Chekhov spent 44 years squeezing an entire artistic revolution into a life that tuberculosis kept trying to cut short. He wrote nearly 600 stories and 17 plays while practicing medicine, building schools, fighting cholera epidemics, and traveling to a prison colony that most people didn't even know existed. And he did all of this while pretending he wasn't dying. The world remembers him for The Seagull and the Cherry Orchard, for inventing the modern short story, for that principle about guns on walls that screenwriters still quote today. But the man behind those works was stranger and more contradicted than any character he created. A doctor who barely practiced, a writer who started as a hack, a man from a family one generation removed from slavery who became Russia's most sophisticated literary voice. This is the story of how that happened. And it starts in a place Chekhov spent most of his adult life trying to forget. Taganrog in 1860 was a port city on the Sea of Azov in southern Russia, which sounds more romantic than it was. Commercial, dusty, provincial. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone's business, and most of that business involved trading grain or fish. Into this world, on January 29th, Anton Pavlovich Chekhov was born, the third of 6 children who had survived to adulthood. His grandfather had been a serf. Think about that for a moment. Chekhov's grandfather was property, a human being who could be bought and sold like livestock. In 1841, less than 20 years before Anton's birth, his grandfather managed to buy freedom for himself and his family. The price was 3,500 rubles, an enormous sum. This wasn't ancient history for the Chekhov family. This was living memory. Anton grew up knowing that his father had been born into slavery. This fact haunted him. Later in life, he would write that he had to squeeze the slave out of himself drop by drop. He wasn't speaking metaphorically. He was talking about inherited trauma, about the psychological residue of subjugation that doesn't disappear just because legal status changes. The weight of that history pressed down on everything he wrote. Pavel Chekhov, Anton's father, was a grocer. He owned a small shop in Taganrog where he sold tea, sugar, cooking oil, and kerosene. On paper, this represented upward mobility. The son of a former serf, now a business owner, Pavel saw himself as a respectable merchant, a pillar of the community, deeply religious and determined that his children would be educated, refined, better than he was. In reality, Pavel was a tyrant, ultra-orthodox in his Christianity, physically abusive, prone to violent rages over nothing. Too much salt in the soup could trigger an explosion. He forced his children to work in the shop before and after school, standing for hours in the cold waiting for customers. He made them sing in his amateur choir, rehearsing late into the night, even when they had lessons the next morning. He beat them regularly. Anton later wrote to his brother about their childhood, describing the horror and disgust they felt. He used the word suffering repeatedly. This wasn't the selective memory of an unhappy adult rewriting the past. This was genuine trauma that shaped everything about how Chekhov understood human nature. His mother, Yevgenia, was different. Softer, quieter, powerless to protect her children from their father, but trying in small ways. She told them stories. She showed them kindness when Pavel wasn't watching. She was the first person to teach Anton that gentleness existed, even in a house built on fear. Young Anton attended the Greek school in Taganrog first, then the Taganrog Boys' Gymnasium. He wasn't a brilliant student. Actually, he failed ancient Greek at 15 and had to repeat a year. This humiliation probably stung more than we can imagine. Here was a boy who had become one of the greatest writers in Russian literature, held back for failing an examination in a dead language he'd never use. But those school years gave him something. time away from the shop, time away from his father, and most importantly, time to read. He discovered Cervantes and Turgenev. He absorbed Goncharov and Schopenhauer. He started writing a full-length comic drama called Fatherless, which was probably terrible, but showed him what was possible. Then in 1876, everything collapsed. Pavel had overextended himself financially, borrowing money to build a new house the family couldn't afford. When the creditors came calling, he faced debtor's prison. So he did what terrified men often do. He ran. Pavel fled to Moscow in the middle of the night, leaving his wife and children to deal with the wreckage. Anton was 16 years old. His two older brothers, Alexander and Nikolai, had already left for university in Moscow. His mother took the three younger children and followed Pavel. Anton was left behind in Taganrog, alone, to finish his education and try to sell the family's possessions to pay their debts. The house was sold to a man named Selivanov, who allowed Anton to board there while finishing school. This arrangement appears almost exactly in The Cherry Orchard, decades later, where Lopakin has bought out a family that once owned him. Chekhov rarely forgot anything that hurt. For 3 years, from age 16 to 19, Anton Chekhov lived essentially alone in the house, where he'd grown up, which now belonged to someone else. He supported himself by tutoring other students. He sent what money he could to his family in Moscow, who were living in poverty, and he read everything he could get his hands on. This period of isolation did something to him. You can see it in everything he wrote later. That distance he maintained from his characters, that refusal to judge or explain, that sense of watching life from just outside the frame. He learned early that nobody was coming to rescue him, that survival meant relying on yourself, that families could dissolve overnight and leave you standing in an empty house that used to be yours. But he also learned something else during those years. He learned that stories could be sold, small sketches and jokes sent to humour magazines in Moscow under fake names. They paid almost nothing, but they paid. Writing wasn't just something he did for himself anymore. It was a skill that could generate income. This realization would change everything. In 1879, Chekhov finished school and left Taganrog. He would return only occasionally, and never for long. He took a train to Moscow, carrying almost nothing, heading toward a family he hadn't seen in 3 years and a future that was completely uncertain. Moscow, in 1879, was exploding. 500,000 people crammed into a medieval city that wasn't built for them, living in overcrowded apartments, working in factories, creating a new kind of urban Russian culture that nobody quite understood yet. For someone coming from a provincial port town, it must have been overwhelming. Chekhov's family was living in a basement apartment in one of Moscow's poorest districts. The room was dark, damp, barely large enough for all of them. Pavel had found work as a clerk. The older brothers were trying to make it as writers and artists. Everyone was broke. Everyone was surviving day to day. And into this chaos, Anton arrived with a scholarship to medical school. He'd been accepted to the I.M. Sechenov First Moscow State Medical University, one of Russia's most prestigious institutions. This was his ticket out. Medicine meant a stable career, respect, financial security, everything his family had lost. But there was a problem. The scholarship covered tuition, not living expenses. Someone had to support the family. Pavel was earning almost nothing. Alexander and Nikolai were barely supporting themselves. That left Anton. At 19 years old, newly arrived in Moscow, starting medical school, he became the primary breadwinner for his entire family. So he wrote, constantly, obsessively, short humorous sketches for magazines and newspapers. He wrote under pseudonyms. Antosha Chekonte was his favourite, a nickname from his school days. Man Without Spleen was another. He signed pieces with abbreviations, with symbols, with whatever the editor wanted. It didn't matter. What mattered was the payment. These early stories were disposable. Jokes about drunken husbands and nagging wives, sketches of bureaucrats and pompous officials, dialogue written to fit in a few column inches. Nobody expected them to last longer than the newspaper they were printed in. Chekhov called himself a hack, and he wasn't being falsely modest. He was writing commercial content as fast as he could type it, the way modern content creators pump out videos to pay rent. But he was learning. Every story taught him something about structure, about timing, about what landed with readers and what didn't. He was serving an apprenticeship in the mechanics of narrative, doing thousands of repetitions of the basic moves. And because he was writing so much, he could experiment. A story that failed meant nothing. There'd be another one tomorrow. Medical school demanded his attention too. The curriculum was brutal. Anatomy, physiology, pathology, all of it requiring memorization and precision. He attended lectures during the day, studied late into the night, and somehow found time to write between everything else. Sleep became optional. His health, already not great, started deteriorating. But medicine gave him something writing alone couldn't. It gave him access. As a medical student, he could walk into any part of Moscow society. He examined prostitutes and aristocrats, peasants and merchants, factory workers and intellectuals. He saw people at their most vulnerable when the social masks came off. He saw what fear looked like, what poverty did to bodies, how pain manifested differently in different classes. This wasn't research, he wasn't taking notes for future stories, but everything he witnessed sank in. The way a merchant's wife held herself differently when her husband was in the room. The specific kind of exhaustion in a labourer's eyes. The subtle gradations of shame and pride that marked every interaction. Medicine taught him to observe without judging, to look for symptoms beneath the surface presentation. Those skills would make him a different kind of writer. In 1884, Chekhov graduated with his medical degree. He was 24 years old. He'd been supporting his family for 5 years, while completing one of Russia's most demanding academic programs. He'd published hundreds of stories under various pseudonyms. He was exhausted, sick more often than not, and had no idea what came next. The smart move would have been to establish a medical practice, build a patient base, earn a steady income, secure his family's future. That's what his father wanted. That's what his degree was for. But Chekhov kept writing. In fact, he was writing more than ever, and the work was starting to change. Something had shifted. The stories were getting longer, more complex. The jokes were darker. The characters were developing inner lives that had nothing to do with the punchline. He was still writing for the same humour magazines, still signing with pseudonyms, but the work itself was mutating into something else. In 1886, something happened that made him reconsider everything. Dmitry Grigorovich, a celebrated Russian writer who was 64 years old and near the end of his career, read one of Chekhov's stories, The Huntsman, a short piece about a peasant woman who encounters her estranged husband in the woods. Nothing special on the surface, but Grigorovich saw something in it. He wrote Chekhov a letter that hit like a thunderbolt. "You have real talent," Grigorovich said, "a talent that places you in the front rank among writers in the new generation." He begged Chekhov to take his gift seriously, to stop wasting it on disposable content, to respect his own abilities enough to write with care and intention. Chekhov's response revealed everything about where he was mentally. He confessed that he'd been writing mechanically, half-consciously, caring nothing about either the reader or myself. He'd been treating writing like a job, churning out content to pay bills, never stopping to consider whether what he was producing mattered. Grigorovich's letter forced him to confront that. But here's the complicated part. Chekhov couldn't just stop writing for money. His family still depended on him. Medicine wasn't generating significant income yet. The bills kept coming, so he had to figure out how to do both simultaneously. How to write with artistic integrity, while still producing enough volume to survive financially. How to be both hack and artist at the same time. This tension would define the next phase of his career and push him toward innovations that would change literature itself. Because Chekhov was about to discover that you could tell profound truths in small spaces, that stories didn't need to be long to matter, that the space between words could carry as much weight as the words themselves. The play was a success, but something darker was happening beneath the surface of Chekhov's triumph. His body was failing him in ways he could no longer ignore. In March 1897, while dining at a Moscow restaurant with his editor Suvorin, Chekhov suddenly began coughing blood. Not a little. Enough that other diners stared. Enough that Suvorin immediately called for help. Chekhov, the doctor, knew exactly what this meant. The tuberculosis he'd been denying for over a decade had advanced beyond the point of pretense. He was admitted to a clinic. The diagnosis was official now. Documented, unavoidable. Tuberculosis in both upper lobes of his lungs. The doctors were blunt. Change everything or die soon. Stop working so hard. Leave Moscow. Go somewhere warm. Rest. Chekhov hated every word of it, but his body left him no choice. The hemorrhage had terrified him in a way his earlier symptoms hadn't. He'd been coughing blood since 1884, dismissing it as nothing serious, working through it, refusing treatment. Now he couldn't pretend anymore. The disease was winning. This is where Chekhov's story takes on a strange duality. On one hand, his literary reputation was soaring. The Seagull success at the Moscow Art Theatre had vindicated him. He was writing some of his finest work. On the other hand, he was dying, and he knew it. The contradiction shaped everything that followed. His last 7 years were a race between creation and dissolution. After his father died in 1898, Chekhov made a decision that would define this final phase. He bought land on the outskirts of Yalta, that resort town on the Crimean Peninsula where wealthy Russians went to recover from illness. He built a villa there, the White Dasha they called it. White walls surrounded by gardens. Yalta became his prison. Oh, he made it beautiful. Planted trees, flowers, kept dogs and tamed cranes. Designed the gardens himself. Received visitors, famous ones. Leo Tolstoy came. Maxim Gorky came. Writers, artists, admirers made pilgrimages to see the great Chekhov at his seaside retreat. But Chekhov called it his hot Siberia. He was 38 years old and felt exiled from the life he wanted to live. Moscow was where theatre happened, where his friends were, where he felt connected to the pulse of Russian cultural life. Yalta was quiet, warm, medically appropriate, and suffocating. He wrote to his brother, "I'm so bored I could scream." The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent years dreaming of a quiet place to write. Now that he had it, enforced by illness, he craved the chaos he'd left behind. But here's what's remarkable. Despite the frustration, despite feeling trapped, despite his deteriorating health, Chekhov kept working. And the work was changing. Uncle Vanya premiered at the Moscow Art Theatre in 1899. It's a play about stagnation, about lives unlived, about people trapped in situations they can't escape. The central character works for years to support his sister's husband, a pompous professor he believes to be a great man. Then he realizes the professor is mediocre, his sacrifice meaningless, his life wasted. Sound familiar? The play is devastating precisely because nothing dramatic happens. No one dies, no great revelation changes everything. People just realize they've been fooling themselves, and then they continue anyway, because what else can they do? Critics sometimes read Uncle Vanya as Chekhov processing his own sense of wasted time. All those years writing hack work to pay bills, all those patients treated instead of stories written, all those compromises that seemed necessary at the time. Was any of it worth it? But that reading is too simple. Chekhov wasn't wallowing in regret. He was examining something more interesting. How do people live with disappointment? What happens after you realize your life isn't what you hoped it would be? His answer, you keep going. Not heroically, not tragically. Just daily, mundanely, because that's what humans do. Uncle Vanya ends with the title character returning to his account books after his emotional breakdown. Life continues, work continues, the dream is dead but the routine persists. It's almost unbearably sad. except Chekhov finds something dignified in that persistence. This became the signature of his late work. Not traditional tragedy, where great people fall, but something quieter and more modern. Ordinary people confronting ordinary disappointments and somehow continuing. The Three Sisters, which premiered in 1901, takes this even further. Three sisters in a provincial town dream of returning to Moscow, the city of their childhood, where they believe life will finally begin properly. The entire play is about waiting for that return. It never happens. By the final curtain, Moscow is further away than ever, and they're still stuck. What makes it brilliant is that Chekhov doesn't present this as defeat exactly. It's just life, the gap between what we want and what we get. The sisters aren't tragic heroines. They're people who had certain expectations that didn't pan out, like most people. Audiences found this almost unbearably realistic, but while Chekhov was writing these plays in Yalta, something unexpected happened in Moscow. He fell in love. Olga Knipper was an actress with the Moscow Art Theatre. She'd performed in The Seagull, played Arkadina. Chekhov had noticed her, of course. Hard not to. She was talented, vivacious, everything the isolated writer in Yalta wasn't experiencing. They started corresponding. His letters were playful, teasing, full of the wit that illness couldn't diminish. He called her ridiculous pet names. Doggy, baboon, cricket, little German because her parents were ethnic Germans. Her letters back were more serious, more intense. She was falling in love with him and didn't hide it. Chekhov was terrified. Not of love exactly, of what love would require. He was dying. He knew it. What kind of life could he offer her? Stuck in Yalta for his health while she performed in Moscow. It was impossible. They saw each other when they could. Brief visits between his medical exile and her theatrical commitments. The relationship developed in fragments, letters filling the gaps between meetings. In May 1901, they married. Suddenly. Quietly. So quietly that Chekhov's mother and sister didn't even know until after the ceremony. It wasn't romantic elopement. It was two people in their late 30s making a practical decision with full awareness of its complications. The marriage was strange from the start. Not unhappy, just structurally impossible. Olga stayed in Moscow, performing every night. Chekhov stayed in Yalta, following doctor's orders. They lived apart more than together, their relationship sustained by letters that reveal two very different emotional registers. His letters remained light, joking, deflecting serious feeling. Hers were raw, swinging between joy and despair. Guilt about choosing theatre over marriage, anxiety about his health. Did it work? Depends what you mean by work. They loved each other. That seems clear from the correspondence, but they also lived separate lives by necessity. Chekhov seemed almost relieved by the arrangement. The distance protected him from having to be a proper husband, from having to let someone see him deteriorate fully. Olga felt perpetually torn. Her career was thriving just as his health was failing. Should she give up the theatre and sit with him in Yalta? He didn't want that. He encouraged her to keep performing, but the guilt ate at her anyway. Meanwhile, Chekhov was writing his final play. The Cherry Orchard is about a family losing their estate. They've owned it for generations, but they're in debt and it's being auctioned off. A former serf, now wealthy, offers to help them save it, but they can't bring themselves to accept his pragmatic solution. They drift, paralysed by nostalgia, unable to act, until the estate is sold and they have to leave. It's about the end of an era. The old aristocratic Russia giving way to something new. The characters represent different responses to change. Some cling desperately to the past, others embrace the future. Most just feel confused and displaced. Chekhov called it a comedy. Stanislavski wanted to direct it as tragedy. They argued about this constantly. Chekhov insisted there were funny parts, that the characters were ridiculous, that their inability to save themselves was almost absurd. Stanislavski saw only sadness. Both were right. That's the genius of it. The play exists in that space between laughter and tears where most of life actually happens. The family losing their estate isn't tragic in the classical sense. They're not great people brought low, they're mediocre people failing to adapt, which is sad but also kind of their own fault, which is also kind of funny if you squint. That ambiguity is what makes the play timeless. But Chekhov would never see how timeless it became. By the time The Cherry Orchard premiered in January 1904, he was too ill to properly appreciate its success. He attended the premiere, received ovations, but he could barely stand. His tuberculosis had reached its final stage. Breathing was difficult, pain was constant. The doctors had run out of options except making him comfortable. In June 1904, Chekhov and Olga travelled to Badenweiler, a spa town in Germany's Black Forest. One last attempt at treatment, though everyone knew it was futile. Chekhov knew it. Olga knew it. They went anyway, because what else do you do? The end came on July 15th, 1904. Chekhov was 44 years old. Olga's account of his death is almost unbearably intimate. He was struggling to breathe. The doctor was called, injected him with camphor, ordered champagne to stimulate his heart. Chekhov took the glass, examined it, smiled at Olga. "It's a long time since I drank champagne," he said. Then he drained the glass, lay down on his left side, and died. Those were his last words, witty to the very end, making a joke while dying. Very Chekhov. His body was transported back to Moscow in a refrigerated railroad car meant for oysters. Maxim Gorky was offended by this detail. It seemed undignified the great writer shipped like seafood. But Chekhov probably would have appreciated the absurdity. Thousands attended his funeral. Some of them followed the wrong procession by mistake, ending up at the military funeral of a General Keller instead. There was confusion, crowds, a military band playing for the wrong dead man. Chekhov was buried at Novodevichy Cemetery next to his father, the man who'd beaten him as a child, whose tyranny had poisoned his youth. They lie side by side now, whatever grudges dissolved by time and death. What Chekhov left behind was a body of work that changed literature permanently, not through manifestos or dramatic innovation, but through quiet accumulation. Story after story, play after play, each one examining ordinary life with extraordinary attention. His influence is so complete, it's almost invisible now. We take for granted that stories can be plotless, that plays can lack traditional dramatic structure, that characters can be complex and contradictory without clear moral lessons. Chekhov made that normal. Before him, stories had to build to something, resolve something, teach something. After him, they could just observe, just capture a moment, just ask questions without answering them. He once said, "The role of the artist is to ask questions, not answer them." That became the modernist creed, but Chekhov wasn't being theoretical. He was being practical. Life doesn't provide neat answers, so why should art? His characters don't learn satisfying lessons. They don't grow in obvious ways. They just live, make mistakes, feel things, continue existing. That's revolutionary. Not in a loud way, in a quiet, permanent way that reshaped what fiction could do. The short stories alone would have secured his legacy. Nearly 600 of them, ranging from early comic sketches to late masterpieces like The Lady with the Dog. That story, about an affair between two married people, contains no judgment, no punishment, no clear resolution. Just two people trying to figure out what they feel and what to do about it. It ends with them still uncertain, still trapped in their circumstances, still loving each other without knowing how that love can exist in the world they inhabit. Most writers would have forced a conclusion. Chekhov just lets it hang there, unresolved, like life. His plays had even more impact on theatre. The Moscow Art Theatre adopted the seagull as its emblem to commemorate the seagull's triumph. That symbol still represents them today, over a century later. Stanislavski's method of psychological realism, which became the foundation of modern acting, developed partly through working on Chekhov's plays. The text demanded it. You couldn't perform Chekhov through grand gestures and declamation. You had to find the interior life, the subtext, what wasn't being said. That's what Chekhov understood before almost anyone else. Drama isn't in the big moments. It's in the pauses, the things people don't say, the tiny adjustments we make to get through each day. Three Sisters ends with the three sisters watching soldiers march away, taking with them any hope of change. One sister says, "If we only knew, if we only knew." That's it. That's the final line. No wisdom, no closure, just that yearning for understanding that never comes. Audiences sat in stunned silence when they first heard it. Then they applauded until their hands hurt. They recognized something true in that inconclusiveness. Life feels exactly like that. We move through it half-blind, hoping for clarity that rarely arrives. Chekhov died young, but he'd already transformed literature in ways that would take decades to fully understand. The writers who came after him couldn't escape what he'd done. Hemingway stripped his prose down to bare essentials, but Chekhov had already shown that less could mean more. Carver wrote about ordinary people in quiet desperation. That's pure Chekhov. Alice Munro built entire stories around moments that don't resolve. She was working in territory Chekhov had mapped decades earlier. It wasn't just English language writers. Chekhov's influence spread everywhere literature existed. Japanese writers embraced his restraint, his attention to small gestures. Latin American authors absorbed his method of letting silence carry weight. European playwrights rebuilt theatre on foundations he'd laid. The whole modernist movement, whether they acknowledged it or not, was walking paths Chekhov had cleared. But here's what's strange about his legacy. He never meant to be revolutionary. He was just trying to write honestly about what he saw. The innovation came from refusing to lie, refusing to impose false order on messy reality. Other writers were constructing elaborate plots and moral frameworks. Chekhov looked around and thought, life doesn't work like that. So he stopped pretending it did. His stories from the 1880s show this evolution. Early pieces like The Death of a Government Clerk are comic sketches, clever but slight. A man sneezes on a general at the theatre and dies from anxiety about the social transgression. It's funny, pointed, but it's still a joke with a punchline. By the 1890s, he's writing The Lady with the Dog, where a man has an affair and realises he's in love for the first time in his life, but there's no solution, no way forward, just the recognition that real feeling has entered his careful, comfortable existence. That's not a sketch. That's literature, confronting the fundamental problem of being alive. The progression wasn't smooth. Chekhov doubted himself constantly. His letters are full of self-criticism, complaints that he's wasting his talent on trivial work, worries that he'll never write anything that matters. Even after major success, he questioned whether his plays were any good. After the Seagull's disastrous premiere, he genuinely believed he should quit theatre entirely. It took Stanislavski's production 2 years later to convince him otherwise. That insecurity shaped the work in unexpected ways. Because Chekhov never felt certain he was right, he left space for other interpretations. His characters aren't mouthpieces for his views. They believe contradictory things. They act against their own interests. They're confused, just like actual people. That uncertainty at the core of his method became one of his greatest strengths. Consider Ward Number 6, written in 1892. A doctor runs an asylum where patients are treated brutally. He befriends one of the inmates, an educated man driven mad by persecution. They have philosophical discussions about suffering and meaning. Eventually, the doctor is committed to his own asylum and dies there, beaten and neglected. Critics read it as commentary on Russia's political repression. Lenin supposedly said it terrified him, but Chekhov insisted he wasn't making a political point. He was just describing what he'd observed, showing how thin the line is between doctor and patient, sanity and madness, freedom and imprisonment. His medical background gave him unique insight into human psychology. He'd seen people at their most vulnerable, stripped of social pretense by illness. He understood that we're all barely holding it together, that dignity is fragile, that suffering doesn't ennoble anyone, it just hurts. This clinical perspective, combined with genuine compassion, created something new in literature. He could be ruthlessly observant without being cruel, could show weakness without contempt. The peasant stories reveal this balance most clearly. Urban Russian writers traditionally romanticized peasant life, or used peasants as symbols of moral purity. Chekhov actually knew peasants. He'd treated them, lived near them, observed their daily struggles. In Peasants, he describes their poverty, ignorance, and brutality without flinching. The family is hungry, cold, barely surviving. The father beats his wife. They steal from each other. But Chekhov doesn't condemn them or hold them up as noble sufferers. They're just people trying to survive in impossible circumstances, sometimes decent, sometimes terrible, mostly both at once. His time at Melikovo deepened this understanding. He wasn't just visiting the countryside, he was living there, functioning as the village doctor, dealing with cholera outbreaks and peasant ailments. He built schools because he saw children growing up illiterate. He planted gardens because the land could produce more than it was producing. He was pragmatic, solving problems he could solve while recognizing vast problems he couldn't. The Cherry Orchard grew directly from this experience. The play examines the end of the old aristocratic Russia and the rise of a new merchant class. Lopukhin, the former serf who buys the estate where his ancestors were enslaved, isn't a villain or a hero. He's a businessman seeing an opportunity. Ranevskaya, the aristocrat losing her ancestral home, isn't tragic or foolish. She's someone who can't adapt to changed circumstances. The Cherry Orchard itself, beautiful but unprofitable, represents a world passing away. Chekhov shows it happening without judging anyone involved. When the play premiered in January 1904, Chekhov was already dying. He attended the opening night performance at the Moscow Art Theatre, though he was so weak he could barely stand. The audience gave him an ovation that lasted 15 minutes. He stood on stage, coughing, accepting their applause, probably knowing he'd never write another play. It was his final public appearance. That premiere happened on his 44th birthday. The Moscow Art Theatre had planned it as a surprise tribute. Stanislavski gave a speech. Actors presented him with gifts. The whole theatre celebrated his career. Chekhov was embarrassed and uncomfortable, as he always was with public recognition. He wanted to be home, away from the crowd, but his friends had insisted. So he stood there, dying, receiving honours for work that would long outlive him. The contrast between his physical decline and his artistic achievement was stark. His body was failing, lungs destroyed by tuberculosis, but his mind remained sharp. Even in his last months, he was thinking about new stories, making notes for plays he'd never write. The disease had been progressing for 20 years, slowly consuming him while he worked. He'd known since the 1880s that he had tuberculosis. As a doctor, he understood what that meant. No cure existed. It would kill him eventually, probably sooner than later. But he kept working anyway, kept writing, kept practicing medicine, kept building schools and planting gardens. What else could he do? Stop living because death was approaching? That would have been absurd to him. His relationship with Olga Nipper during these final years adds another layer to understanding his work. They married in 1901, but spent most of their marriage apart. She acted in Moscow. He recuperated in Yalta. They wrote letters constantly, hundreds of them, maintaining their relationship through words on paper. The separation was painful, but also oddly fitting. Chekhov's characters are always separated from what they want, always reaching for something just beyond their grasp. He was living that. Their letters show a playful, affectionate relationship. He called her ridiculous pet names. She complained about his jokes and begged him to take better care of himself. Neither of them pretended the situation was sustainable. She had her career. He had his illness. They loved each other and made it work as well as they could. It wasn't a tragedy. It was just difficult, like most things worth having. In June 1904, doctors finally convinced Chekhov to try a health resort in Germany. Badenweiler was supposed to help tuberculosis patients, though by then Chekhov was beyond help. He knew it. Olga knew it. They went anyway because what else do? You try everything until you can't try anymore. The trip was miserable. Chekhov could barely breathe. He'd lost so much weight his clothes hung loose. Other patients at the resort were shocked by his appearance, but he kept his sense of humour, writing letters home describing the absurdities of resort life. The pretentious guests, the useless treatments, right up until the end, he was observing, noting details, seeing the comedy in human behaviour. Even his funeral was like one of his stories, full of confusion and missed connections, and people not quite understanding what was happening. He was buried in Novodevichy Cemetery, the son who'd escaped his father's grocery store to become Russia's greatest writer, resting beside the father who'd made his early life miserable. Chekhov would have appreciated the irony. His influence didn't wait for scholarly recognition. Writers knew immediately that something had changed. Tolstoy's late stories, the whole generation of Russian modernists, they all felt Chekhov's impact. When his works were translated into English in the 1910s and 1920s, British and American writers had the same reaction. This was different. This was new. This was showing them possibilities they hadn't imagined. The translation question matters because Chekhov's style depends so much on precision, on finding exactly the right word, on rhythms specific to Russian. Constance Garnett's translations, which introduced him to English readers, were rushed and sometimes inaccurate, but they were good enough to convey the essential Chekhov, the method, if not the exact music. Later translators improved on her work, but she deserves credit for making him accessible when accessibility mattered most. Theatre companies worldwide started producing his plays, each culture finding something different in them. Japanese productions emphasized the restraint and formality. American productions highlighted the frustrated ambitions. British productions stressed the class dynamics. The plays could absorb all these interpretations because Chekhov had built in ambiguity from the start. Film directors discovered him too. The plays adapted surprisingly well to cinema, despite being so dependent on subtext and silence. A camera could capture what actors didn't say, could show the gap between words and feelings. Some of the best film adaptations barely changed the text. Just let the camera watch people being people, exactly as Chekhov had watched them. His notebooks, published after his death, revealed his working method. He collected observations constantly, writing down overheard conversations, noticed details, small incidents. Then he'd mine these notebooks for story material, finding the narrative hidden in random life. This explained how his work felt so real. He was working from actual observation, not invention. The principle he articulated about removing everything unnecessary, now called Chekhov's gun, became fundamental to modern storytelling. If you mention a rifle in the first act, it must go off by the third. Don't include details that don't matter. Every element should serve the story. This sounds obvious now, but it wasn't then. Victorian fiction was full of elaborate descriptions and tangential episodes. Chekhov stripped all that away. But he didn't follow his own rule rigidly. His stories often include details that don't pay off, observations that go nowhere, moments that don't resolve. Real life works that way. We notice things that turn out to be irrelevant. We expect resolutions that never come. Chekhov understood that perfect structure can feel artificial, that sometimes the meaningless detail makes the story more true. What matters is how his technique infiltrated storytelling everywhere. Raymond Carver built his entire career on Chekhovian principles, those spare, devastating stories about ordinary Americans struggling with ordinary problems. That's pure Chekhov, translated to 20th century America. Alice Munro's stories work the same way, finding the extraordinary hidden in the mundane, letting silence carry as much weight as dialogue. Catherine Mansfield discovered him in the 1910s and immediately recognized a kindred spirit. Her stories started moving in Chekhovian directions, abandoning traditional plot mechanics for something more atmospheric, more psychological. She wrote that reading him made her feel less alone as a writer, that someone else understood what she was trying to do. The influence spread beyond writers who consciously imitated him. The entire architecture of modern short fiction bears his stamp. Stories don't need neat resolutions anymore. They can end on ambiguity, on unresolved tension, on characters still struggling with the same problems they started with. That's Chekhov's legacy. He gave permission for stories to be true rather than tidy. Film theory owes him equally. The concept of subtext, what the camera shows versus what characters say, that's fundamentally Chekhovian. Yasujiro Ozu's films, with their focus on family dynamics and quiet moments of disconnection, are essentially Chekhov movies set in Japan. The long takes, the attention to ordinary detail, the refusal to provide easy emotional catharsis, all of it comes from the same aesthetic. Even television eventually absorbed his influence. The better prestige dramas understand that you can let scenes breathe, that you don't need constant plot advancement, that watching characters exist in space together can be enough. The Sopranos had entire episodes that were basically Chekhov, characters talking past each other, failing to connect, trapped in patterns they couldn't escape. But the real test of his influence is how invisible it's become. Writers use Chekhovian techniques without knowing they're Chekhovian. The methods are just part of the toolkit now. Assumed knowledge, the water we swim in. When someone writes a story about a family gathering where everyone's polite on the surface, but seething underneath, they're being Chekhovian whether they've read him or not. His characters became templates. The person trapped in a provincial town dreaming of Moscow, that's everywhere now. The intellectual who can't act, paralyzed by awareness of complexity, that's half of literary fiction. The couple who've lost whatever they once had, but keep going through the motions, that's basically the entire genre of domestic realism. What he understood about human nature hasn't dated. People still fail to communicate, still mistake activity for purpose, still construct elaborate justifications for not changing, still hope for transformation that never quite arrives. His plays and stories remain relevant because he was writing about permanent features of consciousness, not temporary social conditions. The political readings matter too, though. Soviet critics tried to claim him as a proto-revolutionary, showing the bankruptcy of the old order. This required ignoring how sympathetically he portrayed many of his aristocratic characters, how he never suggested revolution as a solution. Western critics emphasized his humanism, his compassion for all his characters regardless of class. Both readings found support in the texts because Chekhov refused to take sides clearly. He was more radical than either interpretation suggests. Not politically radical, but aesthetically. He demonstrated that you could write about people without judging them, that complexity was more interesting than moral clarity, that showing was more powerful than telling. These seem like obvious principles now, but they weren't in 1900. The question of whether he was a pessimist or an optimist has generated endless debate. His works certainly contain bleakness, characters whose lives amount to frustration and disappointment. But there's also beauty in his attention to detail, in his refusal to look away from suffering, in his insistence that even failed lives deserve serious attention. That's not pessimism exactly. It's something more complicated. He believed in small improvements, the doctor who treats patients, the teacher who educates children, the person who plants a tree. These modest actions matter even if they don't transform society. This appears throughout his work. Characters who do concrete good in limited ways. It's not grand revolutionary optimism, but it's not nihilism either. His letters reveal someone more hopeful than the plays might suggest. He wrote about progress, about Russia improving, about science and education making life better. He believed in human capability for change, even while showing how difficult change actually is. The contradiction isn't really a contradiction. He held both truths simultaneously. The medical background shaped this. Doctors see suffering constantly, but keep treating patients anyway. You don't cure everyone, but you cure some. You reduce pain even when you can't eliminate it. That's the ethic running through Chekhov's work. Do what you can where you are with what you have. His relationship with Tolstoy illuminates the difference between their approaches. Tolstoy wanted to answer the big questions, to tell people how to live, to provide moral instruction. Chekhov wanted to show people living and let them draw their own conclusions. Tolstoy wrote from certainty. Chekhov wrote from doubt. They respected each other, but represented fundamentally different artistic philosophies. When they met, Tolstoy would lecture Chekhov about art and morality. Chekhov would listen politely, and then write plays that ignored everything Tolstoy said. This wasn't disrespect. It was Chekhov being true to his own vision. He couldn't write with Tolstoy's confidence about right and wrong. He saw too many sides of every question. His technique of indirect action, where the important events happen off stage, revolutionized theatre. Someone commits suicide between acts. A duel occurs during intermission. What we see is the aftermath, the characters processing what happened. This forces audiences to engage differently, to piece together events from reactions, to understand that life's crucial moments often happen when we're not watching. Theatre directors initially hated this. They wanted dramatic scenes, confrontations, visible turning points. Chekhov gave them people drinking tea and talking around their problems. It seemed like nothing was happening, but that was the point. Life is mostly people drinking tea and talking around their problems. The drama is internal in what's not said, in the gap between desire and capability. Stanislavski understood this eventually, but it took work. The Moscow Art Theatre's production of The Seagull succeeded because Stanislavski figured out how to stage inaction, how to make emotional stagnation visible. That partnership between playwright and director created modern theatre. They taught audiences how to watch differently, how to pay attention to subtext and silence. The influence on acting was equally profound. Actors had to learn to play against the text, to show what their characters were really feeling beneath the polite conversation. This required a new level of psychological realism. You couldn't just deliver lines convincingly. You had to embody an entire consciousness, complete with contradictions and self-deception. His impact on screenwriting came later, but was just as significant. The best screenwriters understand that what characters say is often less important than what they're not saying. That silence can carry more weight than dialogue. That sometimes the most powerful scenes involve people failing to connect. All of this traces back to Chekhov. The short story form especially bears his mark. Before Chekhov, short stories generally followed a pattern: exposition, complication, climax, resolution. After Chekhov, they could follow consciousness, drift with observation, end without resolving. This opened up entirely new possibilities. The form became more flexible, more capable of capturing actual experience. His influence on the modern short story is so complete that it's hard to imagine what the form would look like without him. Would we have Joyce's Dubliners? Probably not in the same way. Would we have the New Yorker story? That particular blend of social observation and emotional nuance? Almost certainly not. Chekhov created the template that others elaborated. Even writers who rejected his approach defined themselves against him. Hemingway's iceberg theory, where most of the story happens below the surface, that's Chekhov taken to an extreme. The minimalists of the 1980s, stripping prose down to bare essentials, they were following a path Chekhov had cleared. What makes his influence so durable is that he wasn't providing formulas. He was demonstrating a way of seeing. Pay attention to ordinary moments. Notice what people actually say versus what they mean. Understand that lives don't resolve neatly. These aren't rules you can follow mechanically. They're principles that require constant attention and judgment. His plays continue to challenge directors and actors. There's no single correct interpretation. Productions emphasize different aspects, find different meanings, all while using the same text. This flexibility is built into the writing. Chekhov created structures that can absorb radically different approaches without breaking. Some productions play the cherry orchard as comedy, emphasizing the character's ridiculousness. Others play it as tragedy, stressing the genuine loss. Both work because Chekhov wrote both into the text. The family really is ridiculous, and the loss really is tragic. It's both simultaneously. Modern directors sometimes update the settings, placing the plays in contemporary contexts. A Three Sisters, set in present-day America. A Seagull, set in Hollywood. These work surprisingly well because Chekhov was writing about permanent human situations, not temporary social arrangements. The specifics change, but the dynamics remain. His stories get adapted constantly, transformed into films, plays, different time periods, and settings. The Lady with the Dog has been filmed dozens of times, set everywhere from 1950s America to contemporary India. The core situation, two people in a doomed affair trying to find meaning in each other, transcends its original context. What you realize reading criticism about Chekhov across the past century is that each generation finds something different to emphasize. Early critics focused on his realism, his accurate depiction of Russian society. Mid-century critics emphasized technique, his innovations in form. Recent critics examine his psychology, his understanding of consciousness and emotion. All these readings are valid because he was working on all these levels simultaneously. What matters is how his technique infiltrated storytelling everywhere. Raymond Carver built his entire career on Chekhovian principles. Those spare, devastating stories about ordinary Americans struggling with ordinary problems. That's pure Chekhov translated to 20th century America. Alice Munro's stories work the same way, finding the extraordinary hidden in the mundane, letting silence carry as much weight as dialogue. Catherine Mansfield discovered him in the 1910s and immediately recognized a kindred spirit. Her stories started moving in Chekhovian directions, abandoning traditional plot mechanics for something more atmospheric, more psychological. She wrote that reading him made her feel less alone as a writer, that someone else understood what she was trying to do. The influence spread beyond writers who consciously imitated him. The entire architecture of modern short fiction bears his stamp. Stories don't need neat resolutions anymore. They can end on ambiguity, on unresolved tension, on characters still struggling with the same problems they started with. That's Chekhov's legacy. He gave permission for stories to be true rather than tidy. Film theory owes him equally. The concept of subtext, what the camera shows versus what characters say, that's fundamentally Chekhovian. Yasujiro Ozu's films, with their focus on family dynamics and quiet moments of disconnection, are essentially Chekhov movies set in Japan. The long takes, the attention to ordinary detail, the refusal to provide easy emotional catharsis, all of it comes from the same aesthetic. Even television eventually absorbed his influence. The better prestige dramas understand that you can let scenes breathe, that you don't need constant plot advancement, that watching characters exist in space together can be enough. The Sopranos had entire episodes that were basically Chekhov, characters talking past each other, failing to connect, trapped in patterns they couldn't escape. But the real test of his influence is how invisible it's become. Writers use Chekhovian techniques without knowing they're Chekhovian. The methods are just part of the toolkit now. Assumed knowledge, the water we swim in. When someone writes a story about a family gathering where everyone's polite on the surface, but seething underneath, they're being Chekhovian whether they've read him or not. His characters became templates. The person trapped in a provincial town, dreaming of Moscow, That's everywhere now. The intellectual who can't act, paralyzed by awareness of complexity. That's half of literary fiction. The couple who've lost whatever they once had but keep going through the motions. That's basically the entire genre of domestic realism. What he understood about human nature hasn't dated. People still fail to communicate, still mistake activity for purpose, still construct elaborate justifications for not changing, still hope for transformation that never quite arrives. His plays and stories remain relevant because he was writing about permanent features of consciousness, not temporary social conditions. The political readings matter too, though. Soviet critics tried to claim him as a proto-revolutionary, showing the bankruptcy of the old order. This required ignoring how sympathetically he portrayed many of his aristocratic characters, how he never suggested a revolution as a solution. Western critics emphasized his humanism, his compassion for all his characters, regardless of class. Both readings found support in the texts because Chekhov refused to take sides clearly. He was more radical than either interpretation suggests, not politically radical, but aesthetically. He demonstrated that you could write about people without judging them, that complexity was more interesting than moral clarity, that showing was more powerful than telling. These seem like obvious principles now, but they weren't in 1900. The question of whether he was a pessimist or an optimist has generated endless debate. His works certainly contain bleakness, characters whose lives amount to frustration and disappointment. But there's also beauty in his attention to detail, in his refusal to look away from suffering, in his insistence that even failed lives deserve serious attention. That's not pessimism exactly. It's something more complicated. He believed in small improvements, the doctor who treats patients, the teacher who educates children, the person who plants a tree. These modest actions matter, even if they don't transform society. This appears throughout his work. Characters who do concrete good in limited ways. It's not grand revolutionary optimism, but it's not nihilism either. His letters reveal someone more hopeful than the plays might suggest. He wrote about progress, about Russia improving, about science and education making life better. He believed in human capability for change, even while showing how difficult change actually is. The contradiction isn't really a contradiction. He held both truths simultaneously. The medical background shaped this. Doctors see suffering constantly, but keep treating patients anyway. You don't cure everyone, but you cure some. You reduce pain even when you can't eliminate it. That's the ethic running through Chekhov's work. Do what you can where you are with what you have. His relationship with Tolstoy illuminates the difference between their approaches. Tolstoy wanted to answer the big questions, to tell people how to live, to provide moral instruction. Chekhov wanted to show people living and let them draw their own conclusions. Tolstoy wrote from certainty. Chekhov wrote from doubt. They respected each other, but represented fundamentally different artistic philosophies. When they met, Tolstoy would lecture Chekhov about art and morality. Chekhov would listen politely and then write plays that ignored everything Tolstoy said. This wasn't disrespect. It was Chekhov being true to his own vision. He couldn't write with Tolstoy's confidence about right and wrong. He saw too many sides of every question. His technique of indirect action, where the important events happen off stage, revolutionized theatre. Someone commits suicide between acts. A duel occurs during intermission. What we see is the aftermath, the characters processing what happened. This forces audiences to engage differently, to piece together events from reactions, to understand that life's crucial moments often happen when we're not watching. Theatre directors initially hated this. They wanted dramatic scenes, confrontations, visible turning points. Chekhov gave them people drinking tea and talking around their problems. It seemed like nothing was happening. But that was the point. Life is mostly people drinking tea and talking around their problems. The drama is internal, in what's not said, in the gap between desire and capability. Stanislavski understood this eventually, but it took work. The Moscow Art Theatre's production of The Seagull succeeded because Stanislavski figured out how to stage inaction, how to make emotional stagnation visible. That partnership between playwright and director created modern theatre. They taught audiences how to watch differently, how to pay attention to subtext and silence. The influence on acting was equally profound. Actors had to learn to play against the text, to show what their characters were really feeling beneath the polite conversation. This required a new level of psychological realism. You couldn't just deliver lines convincingly. You had to embody an entire consciousness, complete with contradictions and self-deception. His impact on screenwriting came later, but was just as significant. The best screenwriters understand that what characters say is often less important than what they're not saying. That silence can carry more weight than dialogue. That sometimes the most powerful scenes involve people failing to connect. All of this traces back to Chekhov. The short story form especially bears his mark. Before Chekhov, short stories generally followed a pattern: exposition, complication, climax, resolution. After Chekhov, they could follow consciousness, drift with observation, end without resolving. This opened up entirely new possibilities. The form became more flexible, more capable of capturing actual experience. His influence on the modern short story is so complete that it's hard to imagine what the form would look like without him. Would we have Joyce's Dubliners? Probably not in the same way. Would we have the New Yorker story? That particular blend of social observation and emotional nuance? Almost certainly not. Chekhov created the template that others elaborated. Even writers who rejected his approach defined themselves against him. Hemingway's iceberg theory, where most of the story happens below the surface, that's Chekhov taken to an extreme. The minimalists of the 1980s, stripping prose down to bare essentials, they were following a path Chekhov had cleared. What makes his influence so durable is that he wasn't providing formulas. He was demonstrating a way of seeing. Pay attention to ordinary moments. Notice what people actually say versus what they mean. Understand that lives don't resolve neatly. These aren't rules you can follow mechanically. They're principles that require constant attention and judgment. His plays continue to challenge directors and actors. There's no single correct interpretation. Productions emphasize different aspects, find different meanings, all while using the same text. This flexibility is built into the writing. Chekhov created structures that can absorb radically different approaches without breaking. Some productions play The Cherry Orchard as comedy, emphasizing the character's ridiculousness. Others play it as tragedy, stressing the genuine loss. Both work because Chekhov wrote both into the text. The family really is ridiculous, and the loss really is tragic. It's both simultaneously. Modern directors sometimes update the settings, placing the plays in contemporary contexts. A Three Sisters set in present-day America, A Seagull set in Hollywood. These work surprisingly well because Chekhov was writing about permanent human situations, not temporary social arrangements. The specifics change, but the dynamics remain. His stories get adapted constantly, transformed into films, plays, different time periods, and settings. The Lady with the Dog has been filmed dozens of times, set everywhere from 1950s America to contemporary India. The core situation, two people in a doomed affair trying to find meaning in each other, transcends its original context. What you realize reading criticism about Chekhov across the past century is that each generation finds something different to emphasize. Early critics focused on his realism, his accurate depiction of Russian society. Mid-century critics emphasized technique, his innovations in form. Recent critics examine his psychology, his understanding of consciousness and emotion. All these readings are valid because he was working on all these levels simultaneously. The biographical interpretations are trickier. People want to read his life into his work. The dying Chekhov, writing The Cherry Orchard, becomes a metaphor for saying goodbye to beauty. The married but separated Chekhov, writing about failed connections, becomes autobiography. Some of this is probably true, but it's also reductive. He was too deliberate a craftsman to simply transcribe his feelings onto the page. Still, you can trace patterns. After his trip to Sakhalin, the stories got darker, more aware of suffering. After his marriage to Olga, the plays showed more understanding of complicated love. After his health collapsed, death and illness appeared more frequently as themes. The life shaped the work, but the work transformed the life into something else, something more universal. His humour often gets overlooked in favour of the melancholy, but it's there constantly. The absurdity of human behaviour, the ridiculousness of our pretensions, the comedy of people taking themselves too seriously. He found this funny even while he found it sad. The two weren't contradictory for him. They were aspects of the same reality. The moments of grace in his work matter as much as the suffering. A character has a sudden insight. Two people connect briefly before drifting apart again. Someone does something kind for no particular reason. These moments don't redeem the suffering, but they make it bearable. They suggest that consciousness itself, the ability to notice and feel, has value even when what we notice is painful. His relationship with his own work was complicated. He often dismissed his plays as unimportant, called them mere sketches. This was partly modesty, partly genuine uncertainty about their value. He knew he was doing something different, but he wasn't sure it was working. The hostile reception of the Seagull's premiere confirmed his doubts. Only Stanislavski's successful revival convinced him that maybe he'd been right after all. He never stopped revising. Stories published in magazines got rewritten for book collections. Plays went through multiple versions. He tinkered constantly, cutting unnecessary words, sharpening dialogue, removing anything that felt explanatory or forced. This perfectionism came from his medical training. Diagnosis required precision. Writing required the same attention to detail. The notebooks he kept show a mind constantly observing, constantly collecting material. An overheard conversation, a gesture someone made, a detail about light or weather. He'd write these down without knowing how he'd use them, trusting that they'd find their place eventually. This method of working from observation rather than invention gave his work its documentary quality, its sense of reality captured rather than constructed. But he was constructing carefully, selecting and arranging these observed details to create specific effects. The artlessness was art. The seemingly random details were chosen precisely. What looked like slices of life were actually highly organized compositions designed to feel unorganized. This is why his work is so difficult to imitate successfully. You can copy the surface techniques, the understatement, the open endings, the focus on ordinary life, but without the underlying rigor, without the careful selection and arrangement, you just get vagueness and drift. Chekhov's work seems simple because the complexity is hidden. The techniques became influential because they solved problems other writers were struggling with. How do you show internal life without explaining it? How do you create dramatic tension without manufactured conflicts? How do you end a story without resolving everything artificially? Chekhov's answers to these questions changed what fiction could do. Writers who came after him, whether they'd read him or absorbed his influence secondhand, found themselves working in a landscape he'd reshaped. The modernists, the minimalists, the realists who rejected melodrama, all of them were building on foundations he'd laid. Raymond Carver acknowledged the debt explicitly. Alice Munro's stories used Chekhovian techniques of time and revelation. Even writers who claim not to like Chekhov often write in ways his work made possible. The influence extends beyond technique into worldview. His refusal to judge his characters, his insistence that the writer's job is to ask questions rather than answer them. His belief that truth emerges from showing rather than telling, these principles became central to modern literary ethics. You can disagree with them, but you're disagreeing with positions Chekhov established as worth arguing about. His reputation has fluctuated less than most writers of his stature. He's never been unfashionable, never required rediscovery. Each generation finds something different in his work, but nobody disputes that the work matters. The plays get produced constantly, in every conceivable interpretation. Traditional period productions, radical updates, experimental stagings. The texts accommodate all of them because the structure is sound enough to survive radical reinterpretation. The question of what he believed politically remains contested. Soviet critics tried to claim him as a proto-socialist, pointing to his sympathy for the poor and his criticism of aristocratic uselessness. Western readers saw him as apolitical, focused on individual psychology rather than social systems. Both readings miss something. He was political, but not programmatically. He cared about suffering and injustice, worked actively to alleviate both through his medical practice and his social reform efforts, but remained skeptical of grand solutions and ideological certainty. The Sakhalin journey demonstrated this clearly. He went there as a kind of investigative journalist, documented conditions meticulously, published findings that contributed to actual reform. But he didn't write propaganda. He wrote careful observation, trusting that showing the reality would be more effective than editorializing about it. This approach, clinical but compassionate, scientific but humane, characterized everything he did. His death became its own kind of story, the ending he didn't get to write. In June 1904, his tuberculosis had worsened to the point that his doctor ordered him to the spa town of Badenweiler in Germany's Black Forest. Olga went with him. They both knew he was dying, but they maintained the fiction that the trip might help. The German doctor who attended him in his final days later described a man who remained courteous and alert despite obvious suffering, someone who understood medically what was happening to him but faced it with remarkable composure. On the night of July 14th, Chekhov's breathing became laboured. The doctor came, administered camphor and ordered champagne. Chekhov took the glass, examined it with what witnesses described as an almost professional interest, smiled at Olga and said in German, "It's been a long time since I drank champagne." He drained the glass, lay down on his left side and died. He was 44 years old. His last words were characteristic, observational, slightly ironic, aware of the moment's significance without becoming sentimental about it. The return of his body to Moscow turned into unintentional farce, the kind of absurd detail Chekhov himself might have included in a story. His coffin was transported in a refrigerated railway car marked "Fresh Oysters." Some mourners at the station followed the wrong funeral procession, that of a general, complete with military band. When they realised their mistake, they had to hurry to catch up with Chekhov's much smaller, quieter funeral. Gorky was offended by these indignities, but others noted that Chekhov would have appreciated the absurdity. He was buried next to his father at Novodevichy Cemetery in Moscow. The grave is simple, marked by a stone that gives his name, and dates without commentary. Thousands came to the funeral, a mix of intellectuals, theatre people, and ordinary readers who'd found something essential in his work. The outpouring of grief surprised even those who knew he was beloved. Russia was losing something it hadn't fully recognised. It had. What he left behind was a body of work that kept revealing new dimensions. The plays that had seemed so simple turned out to be inexhaustibly complex. Productions continued finding new meanings, new ways of staging the same scenes. The stories that had appeared in newspapers and magazines as disposable entertainment turned out to be literature that would last. The letters, published after his death, showed a mind constantly thinking about craft, about ethics, about what writing could and couldn't do. His influence on theatre was immediate and permanent, Stanislavski's Moscow Art Theatre adopted the seagull as its emblem, a tribute to the production that had saved the seagull and established a new way of performing plays. The method of acting Stanislavski, developed while working on Chekhov's texts, became the foundation of modern realistic performance. Directors and actors still return to Chekhov as a test of their skills, knowing that his work exposes any falseness, any pushing, any failure to trust the text. The short stories influenced fiction even more profoundly. The modernist revolution in narrative, the movement away from omniscient narration and neat resolutions, the emphasis on psychological realism and showing over telling, all of this had multiple sources, but Chekhov was central to it. Writers who'd never read Russian encountered his work in translation and discovered possibilities they hadn't imagined. The form itself changed because of what he'd done with it. But influence is tricky to measure precisely because it becomes invisible. Once something becomes standard practice, you forget it was ever innovative. Young writers learning to show rather than tell, to avoid melodrama, to trust readers with ambiguity, they're using Chekhovian principles without necessarily knowing where they came from. The techniques have been absorbed into the craft itself. What remains distinctive about Chekhov is the combination of qualities that seem contradictory, but in his work coexist naturally. He's compassionate but unsentimental, comic but serious, precise but open-ended, accessible but complex. These aren't balanced compromises, they're genuine fusions where each quality intensifies the others. The precision makes the openness more powerful. The comedy makes the seriousness more bearable. The compassion prevents the unsentimental observation from becoming cold. His career was remarkably short, just 25 years from first publication to death. But the concentration of achievements in that period is extraordinary. Nearly 600 stories, 17 plays, one book-length work of non-fiction, and thousands of letters. The quantity alone is impressive, but the quality across that quantity is what's unprecedented. He maintained standards that most writers achieve only occasionally, if ever, and he did it while practicing medicine, managing family obligations, dealing with chronic illness, and somehow finding time to plant gardens and build schools. The garden at Melikovo became legendary among his friends. He took childlike pleasure in it, writing letters about successful grafts and rare varieties, giving tours that lasted hours. This wasn't escape from serious work. It was part of the same sensibility that shaped his writing. Attention to growth, to seasonal change, to the small satisfactions of nurturing something into existence. The garden was a place where effort produced visible results. Unlike writing where you could never be sure if what you'd made was any good. That uncertainty never left him. Even at the height of his success, with The Cherry Orchard receiving ovations and his stories being recognized as masterpieces, he remained doubtful about his work's value. This wasn't false modesty. It was genuine inability to judge his own achievement, combined with awareness that what he was attempting was difficult enough that failure was always possible. He trusted the process more than the results, kept working according to principles he believed in, even when he couldn't be certain they were producing what he hoped. The letters to Olga during their years of separation show someone trying to maintain connection across distance through humor and tenderness. He called her absurd nicknames, described his daily routines in comic detail, worried about her health while dismissing his own symptoms. The letters reveal someone who could be playful and vulnerable, who needed companionship but also needed solitude for work, who loved her but couldn't or wouldn't restructure his life to be with her consistently. Whether this arrangement satisfied either of them is impossible to say. They maintained it until his death. What would he have written if he'd lived longer? The question is unanswerable, but irresistible. He was 44, an age when many writers are just reaching their peak. He'd mastered the forms he worked in, developed complete artistic maturity. Another 20 years could have produced work we can't imagine. Or perhaps he'd said what he needed to say, explored the territory he was equipped to explore. The work we have feels complete in itself, not a fragment of something larger, but a finished achievement that doesn't require addition. His reputation rests on work that remains permanently contemporary because it addresses things that don't change. People still fail to communicate, still miss opportunities, still drift through lives they don't quite mean to be living. The social structures have changed, the technology has advanced, but the emotional and psychological realities Chekhov examined remain recognizable. His characters' problems are our problems. Their confusions are confusions. Their moments of clarity and connection still offering the same complicated consolation. The modernist experiment in fiction, which Chekhov helped initiate, has itself become historical. We're several movements beyond it now. But his work hasn't become dated in the way that later modernist experiments sometimes feel trapped in their period. This is because his innovations were in service of representation rather than just formal play. He was trying to capture something true about experience. And truth doesn't age the way style does. What he understood about human consciousness, about how we actually think and feel moment to moment, that understanding remains valid. The techniques he developed to represent that consciousness on the page still work because they're based on observation of how attention actually moves, how memory intrudes on present experience, how we understand things gradually rather than through sudden revelation. These aren't stylistic choices that can become unfashionable. They're recognitions of reality that remain accurate. His influence will continue as long as people write fiction and perform plays. The specific techniques may be modified or even rejected, but the questions he asked about what narrative can do, about the relationship between writer and material, about honesty in representation, these questions remain central. Every generation has to answer them again, and Chekhov's answers provide a standard for measuring other solutions. The man himself, the person who lived in Melikovo and Yalta, who planted gardens and treated patients and wrote letters to his wife, that person is gone. What remains is the work and the example of someone who took the craft seriously enough to keep questioning his own methods, who believed that writing mattered even when he couldn't fully articulate why, who maintained integrity in both art and life despite pressures to compromise either one. That example, as much as the specific works, is what makes Chekhov essential. Not just what he wrote, but how he thought about writing. The doctor died at 44, and we're left with the work. That's what endures. Not the man coughing blood in German spas, not the failed marriage sustained by letters, not the gardens he planted or the schools he built. Those mattered to him, mattered enormously, but they're not what changed how we understand storytelling. What changed was this. Before Chekhov, narratives required shape. Beginning, middle, end. Rising action, climax, resolution. Someone learned something or failed to learn it, but either way, the story knew what it was about. After Chekhov, stories could drift like consciousness drifts. They could end without resolving. They could examine lives that didn't build toward anything except more life. This sounds simple now because it worked. Because every writer since has absorbed it, whether they know his name or not. But it was radical when he did it. This insistence that ordinary disappointment deserved the same attention as grand tragedy. That watching people fail to communicate was as dramatic as watching them duel. His characters don't grow. That's what's strange about them. They recognize things about themselves, have moments of clarity, then continue being who they were. Uncle Vanya realizes his life has been wasted and returns to his account books. The three sisters understand they'll never reach Moscow and stand there watching soldiers march away. Ranevskaya loses the cherry orchard and leaves for Paris to repeat the same mistakes elsewhere. This isn't pessimism, it's accuracy. People don't transform through single revelations. They have insights and then forget them, recognize patterns and fall back into them anyway. Chekhov showed this without judgment, which was perhaps his most radical gesture. He didn't condemn his characters for their failures or celebrate their small victories. He just watched them exist. The influence of this approach is so complete it's invisible. Modern fiction assumes you can write about ordinary people doing ordinary things and find meaning in close observation. That assumption came from somewhere. It came partly from Chekhov working in his study at Melikovo while tuberculosis slowly destroyed his lungs, writing stories about provincial doctors and bored wives and people trapped in situations they didn't choose and couldn't escape. He squeezed the slave out of himself drop by drop, or tried to. That comment about inherited trauma, about having to actively unlearn subjugation, that shaped everything. He came from nothing, from a family 1 generation removed from legal slavery, and he became the most sophisticated literary voice in Russia. The distance he travelled wasn't just social, it was psychological, artistic, a complete transformation of possibility. But he never forgot where he came from, the brutality of his childhood, his father's rages, the poverty after the bankruptcy. This stayed with him, informed how he saw power and weakness, shaped his refusal to romanticize suffering or pretend that hardship ennobled anyone. Suffering just hurt, that's all. It didn't make you better or worse. It just hurt and you endured it, or you didn't. His medical practice taught him the same lesson, from a different angle. Illness didn't discriminate. Rich and poor both got sick, both suffered, both died. The body's vulnerability made mockery of social pretension. In the examination room, everyone was just flesh and blood and fear. This democratic view of human frailty runs through all his work. The contradiction, at his core, was that he believed in small improvements while showing how little most improvements mattered. He built schools and treated patients and fought cholera outbreaks because individual acts of care had value even when they didn't fix systemic problems. But his stories and plays showed people trapped in systems that wouldn't change, at least not in their lifetimes. Both positions were sincere. He held them simultaneously without feeling the need to resolve the tension. You do what you can where you are with what you have, knowing it won't be enough, knowing it matters anyway. This isn't optimism or pessimism. It's something more complicated, a refusal of easy categories. The death scene in Badenweiler has become legendary, but what makes it resonate isn't the champagne or the witty last words. It's how completely the moment captures everything about him. Observant to the end, noting details, finding the right tone, ironic but not bitter, aware of the absurdity without being overwhelmed by it. He was dying and he noticed he was dying, and he made a joke about champagne, and then he died. Very Chekhov. What he left behind wasn't a philosophy or a method exactly. It was a way of paying attention to the gap between what people say and what they mean, to the small gestures that reveal everything, to the moments when the mask slips and you see the person underneath, frightened and lonely, and trying to get through another day without falling apart. This attention transformed literature because it suggested that everything was worth noticing if you looked carefully enough. Not just dramatic moments, not just beautiful or terrible things, but the ordinary texture of existence. The way someone holds a teacup, the silence after a question, the specific quality of disappointment in someone's eyes when they realize something they'd hoped for isn't going to happen. His stories and plays are still performed, still read, still taught, not because they're historically important, but because they remain true. The social structures have changed completely. The technology is unrecognizable, but people still fail to say what they mean, still trap themselves in situations they hate, still dream of transformation that never quite arrives. The emotional architecture of human experience hasn't evolved. Chekhov mapped that architecture more precisely than almost anyone before or since. The influence will keep spreading because the problems he addressed don't have solutions. How do you represent consciousness accurately? How do you show people's interior lives without explaining them to death? How do you create dramatic interest in ordinary disappointment? These questions don't get answered permanently. Each writer has to work them out again, and Chekhov's example shows what's possible if you commit fully to honesty over convention. He died young, worked constantly, achieved more in 25 years than most writers manage in twice that time. The tuberculosis that killed him had been destroying him slowly since his 20s. And he knew it, and he worked anyway, because what else do you do? Stop living because you're dying? That would have been absurd to him. Everyone's dying, you work until you can't. The garden at Melikovo, the schools he built, the patients he treated for free, these weren't distractions from his real work. They were the same work approached differently. Paying attention to what needed doing, and doing it without grandiose expectations about results. Planting trees you might not see mature, teaching children who might not remember you, treating patients you can't cure. The value is in the attention itself, in the refusal to look away from suffering or need just because you can't fix everything. His marriage to Olga was impossible, and they made it work as well as they could. His health was failing, and he kept writing anyway. His plays were misunderstood, and he kept refining them. He operated under constraints that would have stopped most people, and he produced work that changed what literature could be. Not through rebellion or manifestos, just through careful observation and refusal to lie about what he saw. The question isn't whether Chekhov was a great writer. That's settled. The question is why his particular gifts matter so much, why we keep returning to him when other writers of equal technical skill have faded. The answer is that he showed us how to look at ordinary life and find it sufficient. Not perfect, not redeemed, just sufficient. Worth paying attention to, worth representing honestly. This is harder than it sounds. The temptation is always to make things neater than they are, to impose pattern where there isn't pattern, to extract meaning where meaning is ambiguous at best. Chekhov resisted that temptation so completely that his work can seem plotless, pointless, like nothing happens, but everything happens. Just quietly, internally, in the space between what people say and what they feel. He gave us permission to write about that space, to trust that readers could handle ambiguity, could live with unresolved questions, could find value in observation, even when observation didn't lead to conclusion. That permission expanded what fiction could do, made it capable of representing experience more accurately than the neat structures that came before. The man who drank champagne and died in a German spa town in 1904 had no idea his work would matter a century later, would influence writers in languages he didn't speak, would reshape theatre and fiction permanently. He just did what he thought was right, wrote what he thought was true, and hoped someone somewhere would understand what he was attempting. We understand. Not completely, understanding is always partial, but enough to know that what he did matters. The stories still work, the plays still breathe, the characters still feel like people you might know, could be, are. That's the legacy. Not immortality exactly, but this, a way of seeing that outlasted the person who saw, a method that transcended its moment, work that remains useful to anyone trying to represent what it feels like to be conscious and alive and trapped in time, watching your life happen and not quite understanding it, reaching for connection that mostly fails, finding meaning in small things because the large meanings are either obvious or impossible. Chekhov showed us that was enough, that the small things, carefully observed and honestly represented, contained everything we needed. Not answers, but better questions. Not solutions, but clearer understanding of problems. Not redemption, but attention, which is its own form of care. The doctor died, the work survived. That's how it goes.